Hello. In this video, we're going to show how to create a workflow that's related to Stealthwatch Enterprise. When you are in SecureX Orchestrator, you can click New Workflow. Once you click the New Workflow, a new panel will show up. In the middle, you can actually pull in different calls into your system. Plus, you can specify what is this workflow. So first of all, you have to name the workflow. I have multiple other names that I've done already. For example, we're going to say flow query workflow. Then you're going to specify the description. You can say for the description of this specific workflow, and you can specify the categories, to which category this actual workflow belong to. It can, depending on your categories you have created, you can actually have workflows there. Variables are the inputs or outputs that this actual workflow can have, and you can also add the triggers. It depends on if there's any specific triggers that this workflow will actually launch. So you're going to specify on where we're going to run this this actual workflow. Since we're going to build a Stealthwatch specific workflow, so we can specify which exact Stealthwatch SMC, for example. In this case, we have created an SMC before, my SMC. In the previous videos, we can choose that one. And also, we can specify to use credentials or no, and we can override them. In this case, because we are using Stealthwatch, the user selection happens in a different way. So typically in any Stealthwatch workflow, what we are trying to do here is we are doing API calls. For any API call for Stealthwatch, we will require to have a login that will generate the first token keys that are going to be used in the remaining part of the workflow. Plus we need a tenant, which is the domain ID that you are querying on. These are the two base things that are required for a Stealthwatch workflow. In this example, I'm going to take an example of existing workflows that we have actually built before. For example, we call them core workflows. At some point, you can actually import these workflows into your own system and have them already built in. But if you want to build your own, for example, first thing you're going to do is get token. Get token is actually, it's attempting to do a login. So if we look at this into details, the first thing at the start, it executes an API request. So this is the API request. It's actually an authenticate. So it takes the base URL from the workflow that we have actually created, takes the information of the target and does /token v2 authenticate. It's a post message, and then you can specify the username in the body and the password. You remember we have specified before the global user and global variable username and password. These are the ones that are used in here to actually authenticate, and then if it fails, we get a specific error message. Otherwise, we search for that token inside the response by itself. We're matching numbers. We extract that token and set it as a variable. So now if you look at this specific workflow, it has actually access token as an output. And you have to specify which endpoint you are actually trying to use to execute this specific login on. So this is a login. This is required for every time you're going to start a Stealthwatch workflow. You have to log in and get that access token. So I'm going to close this one and go back to the main flow just to show the other ones. Get tenant is also the second required actually workflow. So for any time you're actually trying to do also a Stealthwatch query, you need to have, other than the token, actually to know the domain. So in this case, also this call is also dependent from a previous one. So you need the access token. How to get the access token from a previous actual action? You go on. You can click on this on this sign on the right side and choose the activity, because it's an activity. SMC get token, and what you need is the access token. So we take the output of SMC get token and insert it as an input for the SMC get token. So that's it primarily how we are passing the variable from one action to another. So again, those are defined as atomic actions. At a certain stage, you're gonna be able to import those, but This is to show you how you can create those even on your by yourself without even waiting for this workflows to be available to use them. So this is also very simple, and it execute an API request. This API request is actually SW reporting v1 tenants. I'm gonna show also where you can find all these specific API calls to use them in order to create your own calls. And you can get, it's a get action, and you can also specify these are the access token as required, and the output from this actual workflow is the tenant list. So execute API request. This is what it does. It takes that access token and use it to actually get the API, and also it uses the same access token key to be used in order to do the query again. Again, if it fails, this is the logic. What the query fails, you get an error message. Otherwise, it sets the output variable for the tenant list. So this does only one thing, getting tenant list. So now the first two actions are get token, second one get tenants, and from here onward you can start to do any type of different workflow. In this case, we're creating flow query, so I'm gonna say it's a flow query by IP address. Gonna drag and drop this one. Again, I'm gonna show you how to create this one specifically, but for any workflow, instead of building the whole thing into one, you create small workflow and you can refer them without having them to be atomic even. I'm gonna show that in a bit. So you can enter the IP address as a variable, so which IP you are trying to query, the start date, the end date, how many flows, and again you need that same access token and the tenant ID. So now the access token is the same access token we took from before from the activity SMC login, and the tenant ID is actually from the activity get tenants, and what we need is the tenant list. We can use that one to take that tenant ID. You can also if your tenant list has a lot of different tenant, we use that is a JSON path query. You can use it to actually parse the first value and take that one only to be used inside the system. So so this is an example how to create different workflow. Let's go deeper into the SMC get workflow. So if I look at modify, click OK. So the first thing is we're formatting some dates that are inputted from the different workflow because the way the dates are actually executing using Stealthwatch. We launch a flow query. The flow query is actually SMC reporting tenants, and it has the tenant ID plus flow plus queries, and then inside the body you can actually use that to do the different parameters for the query. It includes a specific, this is the source IP, it's inside the subject IP address, the records, then is a limit of number of records, and this is start time and the end time. And also you have to use, again, the access token from the first flow. This is the execution, and then it executes the query, it extracts something called the query ID, which is the ID of that specific query, and then we do a sleep for a second. Then what we do is check if the query is actually finished, because the query takes some time. This is again another flow query request. It's actually using the same concept, tenants, the tenant ID, flow queries, and this one says that specific query ID in order to check the results. And we keep on actually doing that again and again. We check the if it's actually the status, if actually the status is finished or not. We extract the job ID, and then we look at if the job complete, we exit. Otherwise, we actually keep on waiting for that specific query. And then we extract the query results, use workflow target, and then we extract those results. Usually this is the flow query results, and we set them as output variable for that specific flow. So this is exactly how to do a flow query. We use the dates, the source IP, the first as a variable, and then we can actually check for the status of that query if it's finished. Once it's finished, we extract the results and post them out as output for that flow. So this is an example of what is needed to create a workflow in Stealthwatch. We took information about how to log in, how to do get the tenant, and then you get the flows. get the flows. So this is actually, we looked at each of these specific queries to create your own workflows. You can start randomly, but if you try to do that specific any type of query, you have to have get token and get tenant first. You can create your own. It's quite easy. It's part of any type of workflow. You need those as base for any query you're doing with Stealthwatch. So now let us look where we can actually find a lot of info about how to create some of these API calls. So because the orchestrator is depending on API calls, where to look for some API documentation or API calls examples. So if you go to your Stealthwatch system, if you add under any of your system SW reporting v1 docs, then you can actually start to get all the documentation information on all of these that is built in your Stealthwatch system, including how to get tenants, how to create custom host, how to get information about devices, the exporters, interface status, traffic on those, how to get external host, external threads, how to do internal hosts, creating new host groups, deleting host groups, looking at security events, also doing flow reports. This is the v1 docs. Also for your system, you can actually also add the SW v2 reporting v2 docs. Also you get a lot of documentation on the newer also capabilities in the APIs. Also a very handful URL that can be really very useful for you guys is developer.cisco.com/Stealthwatch. Once you get on this one, you get the option to go to see Stealthwatch Enterprise or Stealthwatch Cloud API documentation and examples. So if I click on Stealthwatch Enterprise, you get the option to view the documentation, which is right here. I'm going to show, it shows all the details combined for v1, v2, for configuration management, and also on top of that, you can actually look at the, for example, if you're looking at the tenant, you can actually create a tenant, you can get the tenants, and also you can try to query and try that specific call from here, specify the tenant ID, specify the version. You can also see what are the cookies and get the results also to do a trial on that. This is very useful for you guys if you want to try some API calls before you actually implement them inside the orchestrator. Plus, there is a very useful link for in DevNet for some sample examples about Stealthwatch Enterprise and also Stealthwatch Cloud. In this specific location, we're looking at Stealthwatch Enterprise. There is what is the prerequisites, how to configure the system if you need to, just for example, and you can actually also go on GitHub and view these specific calls and example scripts, download them and try them in your own IDE before actually using them inside your environment, or try to implement them inside the orchestrator. Once the GitHub repository is actually open, it will look like that. You'll have the Python section, which includes all the scripts, and also you'll have all the information regarding the compatibility, the usage, and the known issues. You can click on the Python section and you can download any of those pre-existing calls. This is where you can be inspired by the information that is used and how to actually create a Stealthwatch query, a Stealthwatch get security events, for example, how to get the tags, or how to do anything related to Stealthwatch APIs. These are pure examples on how to actually use the APIs, so you can actually try those and use some of the parts of that code to create your own API calls inside the SecureX orchestrator. At a later stage also, we'll have a video that will show how you can import your orchestrator workflow for Stealthwatch Clouds and Stealthwatch Enterprise. We're going to create a pre-built for you a list of workflows that can actually import them if they don't exist in your own environment, and how to actually make use of them without having to rewrite the whole thing again by yourself. There'll be different examples on how to use Stealthwatch and Stealthwatch Enterprise and Cloud with the SecureX orchestrator. So hopefully you have enjoyed this video and it has been informative for you guys.